Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this discussion panel on the effective management of buildings during and after lockdown. I'm joined by three experts from the Building Controls Industry Association and delighted to chair this session this afternoon about how we've used BMS for regulation of commercial buildings. So let me introduce my colleagues in no particular order, but firstly I have Jamie Finnan, who joins me from TR Control Solutions. Jamie's company and TR Controls are a specialist system integrator in technology and applying control systems to the modern built environment. Also with me, delighted to introduce Graeme Rees. Graeme is my Vice President and colleague at the Building Controls Industry Association, and Graeme is the Marketing Manager at Schneider Electric. And welcome to Graeme too. And Graeme gives us a view from a manufacturer's perspective, as well as his broad-based experience in the controls industry from roles before. And finally, but not least, Mike Brooman joins us from Vanti. Vanti are very sort of specialists in embedded technology and master systems integrator into the built environment. So I'm surrounded by experts this afternoon to take on your questions a bit later. Gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you for your time today. So given that question that we've got, effective management of buildings during and after lockdown, Graeme, perhaps firstly, how have you seen building management systems help clients during the lockdown period?
Afternoon, Terry. Thanks for that introduction. I think the first thing, if we cast our minds back, it seems some time ago now, back sort of March, April time, that the real lockdown first happened. And I think the most notable thing for me that building owners and occupiers were faced with was an almost instant, in some cases, change from a regular sort of occupancy pattern to no occupancy. And of course, their buildings and their building systems were operating as normal, yet there was no one within those premises. So I think the first thing, and perhaps most obvious for those with good control systems, particularly those with secure remote connectivity to systems, were able to make use of the controls to make those immediate adjustments to occupancy and scale everything back to a more efficient and suitable pattern based on little or no occupancy in their premises. And one thing I recollect was during that period, it became fairly obvious driving around. You could see, at night or during the day even, some premises that were clearly empty, retail premises, for example, that just looked open. They looked like they were occupied. The lights were on. You couldn't see the plumes from the boilers that you sometimes see, obviously, because we were in the summer months. But you could tell that those buildings were running as if they were occupied. And equally, you could tell those that had decent systems, access to those systems, that were able to react. So that's the first most obvious thing to me that I saw, where controls and good controls with access proved beneficial to clients that had them.
That's an interesting point, as you say, about how quickly that lockdown happened, Graeme, and how we were all caught unaware by it, and how apparent it is in lighting. Jamie, did you see similar things, and what was your observation initially?
Yeah, what I found was with lockdown, it's actually exposed some of the disconnect between control systems, occupation within buildings, and the comfort within the buildings as well. One of the main things we do is monitoring the energy consumption within the buildings, and perhaps unsurprisingly, we didn't see this significant change in energy consumption than one might expect if you had a well-commissioned, a good control system in place. We had some organisations we work with within central London, where you could see that the pattern of energy consumption within the building exactly mirrored that which was before COVID, and even the base loads were staying exactly the same across the board. So a slightly different answer to your question, in that it it really did expose where the control systems were lacking. And the question really now is, how do we improve that? Because we can see it now. There's clear evidence that the control systems aren't where perhaps facilities managers or business owners anticipate they are. And what do we do now to enlighten and engage with those stakeholders to make them better?
Good points there. Mike, Graeme's just told us about, and we all agree, I think, how we were caught somewhat with our trousers down and unexpected for the lockdown to happen. And Jamie's gone on to say about we didn't see a reduction in our base load of energies. So we're being quite critical of what we've gone there. What were the key aspects of BMS, do you think, that enabled us to address those, or what were the recipes or the keynotes that proper users could call upon?
Yeah, I think it's even wider than the BMS, right? So across all building systems, I think what we saw was people with the ability to self-serve, i.e. facilities managers could make changes on their own without needing to engage system specialists. Actually, they were able to respond very quickly because they had the controls to put their buildings into setback modes or vacant modes very easily, and that could be done across a number of different systems. For some clients where they don't have that level of integration between systems, it involved them calling out different specialists from every single discipline. And so getting that work scheduled, making sure it could happen quickly with lots and lots of other clients under that same level of demand, I think meant that some people were lagging in terms of their ability to respond. And unfortunately, they will have the same problem going the other way as they lag in recommissioning those systems and bringing them back online. I think the other thing that we've seen in terms of the wider systems portfolio is the use of occupancy data, and also where people have good relationships with landlords and the ability to dial up things like fresh air and reducing the kind of recirculation as people are coming back. That's made a huge difference as well.
Yeah, that's right, and that's interesting. That self-serve thing immediately sprang in my mind there, the need for training. And we've been saying this for a long time, but quite clearly, as all of us in the trade, we need to spread that word and for training through. From and on those subjects, and back to you, Graeme, I guess. So have you seen any examples of where the contractors haven't been able to self-serve? Was there in the organisations a reactive period of adjustment and come and help me with my systems?
Yeah, I think it was very much a mixed sort of bag, Terry. You know, I think some were taken by surprise, and I think possibly just took for granted that, you know, maybe with limited awareness of control systems per se, you know, these folks just turn up in the office and everything's nice and cozy and comfortable, and they go home at night and just assume that everything is taken care of. There's this magic system behind the scenes that just takes care. So when presented with the issue, we need to do something, you know, some possibly just didn't know where to turn, didn't have the ability to self-serve, and probably, you know, worst case scenario, didn't have a connection with a control specialist of some form that would help them out. Others very well prepared, and, you know, moving the conversation on perhaps a little when there was a necessity to be present. We saw some clients change their shift patterns, for example. So the occupancy would be much lower because of social distancing and so on. But they'd introduced, you know, a longer working day and maybe split, you know, to sort of team A, team B type arrangements. So the working day became much longer. And again, they would engage with their controls specialist either in-house or, you know, hopefully a BCIA member that would make those adjustments to the systems to accommodate that as well. So various levels of awareness, I suppose, and preparedness to act in this scenario. But I think in the early days there were those, and I come back to the point of remote connectivity. I think the most significant difference was those that realized they needed to do something but needed somebody to come out, and the problems that presented. We're going to introduce a different person onto the site. We potentially were putting engineers in harm's way, maybe. That sort of element of risk versus those that were set up with remote connection, secure, cyber secure remote connectivity, were able to react far quicker, far more efficiently, and in a much safer way. There was no need for folks to be put in harm's way, perhaps either at the customer site or the engineers that would be out there in the field. So a mixed bag, really.
That's an interesting point on that remote access. Is there still, Mike, is there still reluctance among end users to allow remote access? Is there a security threat or other obstacles still?
I mean, it's quite a big question. I think ultimately it depends on the organisation. I think you're going to find people who are heavily in the financial services world probably a bit more reluctant to introduce remote access, but I think broadly there, VPNs connecting in with outbound connections initiated from the building. There's multiple ways of solving this, and I think one of the key ways that we normally set things up is to provide some sort of timed access. So depending on whether we manage the operational technology network or it's managed by a client, we would either be delegating access to subcontractors as they need it. So if a BMS contractor needed to remote into the building, we could allow that for a period of time, withdraw that access later. Or in instances where the client controls both the IT and OT networks, we would be contacting them to allow that access. My hope is we're a very long way away from kind of systems being directly on public IP addresses and public IP addresses being tied to buildings. That's an absolute no-no in our book. But yeah, whether it's outbound connections from the building and using a cloud service to connect back in, or time-based VPN access, both are certainly well-secured methods and tried and tested within the IT industry.
Mm. We've spoken there for a few things of the lessons learned, doesn't it? We were caught by surprise. Remote access was our saviour, and those that had the sophistications. But Jamie, who is having the success at the moment? Who are the people who are the ones which are you, and what changes are we seeing to building management systems in live environments today?
The most success we're seeing are those that make the building controls as simple as possible, make the result of the building controls visible to others within the building as well. So I hark back to the energy consumption within the building. If you're able to make that information transparent, if you're able to engage more people within the building, both locally and remotely, of the performance of the building, there tends to be a conversation that happens then, and that engagement drives the improvements within the building management systems and occupancy. If there's a greater inclination to improve the environment that people are working in, be it through better control of temperatures, maybe zonal management, improving that piece, then the control systems and the BMS, I think, become less of that background operation that no one really cares about, and that you just expect it to be working when you arrive. If there's the transparency and greater appreciation of what's happening and what it means through energy and comfort, then they're the organizations that tend to make the improvements and get the greater engagement with facilities teams and control teams. Some of these systems are old, and there isn't necessarily the backbone within the organisation to create that interoperability on site. But if there's a wider engagement and appreciation that actually what we change here does make a difference to all of our lives, they're the organisations that seem to make those improvements and put those investments in.
Yeah, I'm certainly seeing that too, James. I'm in agreement with that at all. But what I'm seeing is at a top level, ultimately, BMS was all about energy conservation and efficient operation of the plant. And actually, in the short term, whilst we're here in these COVID-rich environments and trying to suppress the transmission and so on, energy I'm seeing as having taken a little bit of a back burner, a lot of a back burner. We're more about improving ventilation rates and containment and positive and negative pressurization of sensitive environments and airflow monitoring. Graeme, have you seen any of that, or what techniques have you seen?
Yeah, certainly those recommended guidance at the moment around air change, minimum if zero actually recirculation. In a way, it's kind of frustrating. I get it. Obviously, it's a health and safety thing. It's all about the virus and providing that fresh air. The frustrating bit is it does tend to take us away from the energy messaging. And what was in the headlines before COVID was all about carbon reduction. It was all about climate change, the climate emergency. And I sincerely hope that comes back on the agenda, because it's probably, dare I say it, even a bigger threat than COVID is to the world community. So I hope that comes back into the spotlight. But both of the subjects are controlled and managed with decent control systems in our buildings. We talk about, as you just mentioned, Terry, good ventilation, the recommended guidance from CIBSE around the safest way to ventilate and zone our buildings in the circumstances we find ourselves in. But equally, if we put our carbon reduction hats on, building controls once again come to the fore, because we want to control our buildings efficiently, cost effectively, but equally providing the comfort conditions that employees want and demand in fact. And those two items come together as well, because what we see is more and more, particularly younger generations, wanting to work for and within the buildings of companies that have not only a comfortable environment, but those sort of green credentials, the carbon reduction commitments, and take those things really seriously. Those are sort of brand assets associated with companies and their buildings. So really, two almost opposite ends of the spectrum crises in a way, COVID and carbon reduction, but actually the simple things like building controls can help address both of those really well when done really well. So they come together. I think they're two linked things, but the sooner we get rid of COVID, the better.
Well, I'm sure that we all agree with that. I'm interested that climate change is perhaps even bigger in the long term than COVID. So we very much hope that you're right, and COVID to be a very short-term hiccup that we're globally seeing. A bit more than a hiccup, of course. It's much more serious. Mike, so controls are able to help us in the short term. Graeme mentioned about having sort of increasing fresh air rates and ventilations. What do you see in your business that you're having to implement in the short term?
So I think, the interesting thing for us around the new fresh air demands is actually in multi-tenanted environments. The direction is now kind of coming back to the landlord to kind of say, we actually need more fresh air. And what we're finding is that systems weren't specified well enough to begin with to actually facilitate that. And so I do think there's potentially, and energy is a huge consideration in all this, and we need to get that efficiency right. The 40% stat in terms of buildings burning up all of that carbon and greenhouse gas at the moment. But yeah, I do think we are going to have to go back to the beginning a little bit in terms of designs. We are going to need to allow for more fresh air. And ultimately, I think, Graham's absolutely right. We are going to see a real shift, certainly in commercial spaces, to be not only about reinforcing brand, but also about reinforcing kind of brand experience, and that being not only for employees on an everyday basis, talent attraction, retention, but also facilitating that visitor experience, making sure that people do feel safe in those spaces, that actually you can tell them that you're not recirculating air, that there is lots of fresh air about the place. And I think we're going to see more and more now tenants arriving with their shorter lease patterns. We were talking to a new client the other day who is down to 1 and 2 year leases across their entire portfolio to essentially ensure they can get that flexibility. So I think it's going to start shifting back to the people who actually own the assets. Like, we are going to need to start either retrofitting upgrades or designing things slightly differently, so that if and when this does come around again, actually we are in a position to respond. I think there's going to be some pretty difficult lessons out there. Sadly, in terms of our own building, we're sat in a 1970s print works, so not a huge amount that we can do in terms of the plant that's been afforded to us, but yeah, we are taking as many precautions as we can.
But that's interesting too, and your charming printworks and building there, because the majority of the buildings in the UK are not these shiny glass stainless steel facades. They are retrofit. We've got lots of interesting architecture, thankfully, and refurbishment buildings and characterful buildings that we will operate in. And whilst we can use the control system to make short-term adjustments to increasing the amount of fresh air, we need to be mindful too of what potential damage we're doing to the rest of the plant. Well, I'm thinking of the mornings that are starting to get a bit chilly, aren't they, as we move more into the autumn and the winter period. And so increased fresh air is going to bring in a greater requirement for frost protection monitoring and freeze protection. We'd possibly be pushing the air handling plants and the heating plants outside of their initial design envelope as we're making these short-term changes. So that's now bringing my thoughts around to a complete loop. We started talking about end-user clients self-serving in the early days and when we were all caught unawares. But now, of course, it's the importance about using professionals to undertake some of these modifications and controls professionals I'm thinking of, because of the ramifications of what might happen to the rest of the plant. Jamie, what advice have you got about using appropriate controls and to the end users or mechanical and facilities contractors? How can they ensure they get things done properly?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's come round to the initial point, really, in that buildings and controls need to be more agile, or perhaps the users of those control systems need to be more agile, because things change very quickly now. Built environments change anyway over time. When a control system is first put in and commissioned, it doesn't take long before that initial setup is different to how the building's used from then on. And I guess what we're seeing now is that in a condensed time frame, in that new advice will come out and the way the building is going to be used and operated is going to change week on week. So having the visibility of the control systems, maybe more sensors, more data around the operation of the plant, and making that easily accessible to control specialists is going to help the local teams, or support the local teams, to modify the way the plant works for the building in that environment. It's important, I think, to have an audit as well as you go through. So you're continuing to audit the control systems and the way they're operated within the organisation in line with ever-changing requirements. If you have a full lockdown again, for example, and there's no occupants within the building, are you able to return the building back into those standby modes? Have those lessons been learned from the first time round? So I think it's a greater level of communication between the control specialists and the local FMs, rather than it being segregated. We experience in some buildings where the local FM teams perhaps for a number of years they've been treated with the stick rather than the carrot, and so they're resistant to that engagement and to that collaborative effort. So perhaps that needs to change a bit more as well to improve.
I think Terry, sorry to chime in there, but just to back up what Jamie says, I think he's absolutely right. As soon as a building is completed and handed over and a tenant moves in, you can almost guarantee that the operation of that building will be different to its original intent, which maybe was designed 2 or 3 years prior to occupancy. And the space, the application of the building will be different. So that constant need to be on top and to tweak and to change and refine, is important anyway. Never mind COVID. In normal operation, keeping on top of and good management of the control system is really important. Add into that the COVID challenges, and you mentioned frost protection. I just got this awful thought that someone somewhere throws something into manual. This is what I need to do. We have a really, really cold snap, and suddenly, we got frozen coils and heaven knows what. There are consequences to everything, and I think the guys and girls that operate and maintain control systems understand all of those interactions and complexities, and with good relationships on sites, they understand the end users, application and use, and they're best placed. They're best placed to offer advice on what to do and how to react and how to adjust systems to be best suited to the application of the day. And I say of the day because it seems to change on a daily basis at the moment. So they're best placed to do these things, I believe.
No, I agree with what both.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just sort of come in there, purely because we've had quite a few questions on that. I think, Graeme, when you said somebody's just, sort of slammed it into its manual function and hoped for the best. And certainly one of the questions we've got, which I think is quite an interesting one, is, we did very quickly go into lockdown, and a large proportion of buildings, somebody just sort of switched off or did something. And one of the questions is around, what are we now, did we find that a lot of people were just putting things in locally and hoping for the best? And, is that going to have an impact on how those buildings are being run going forward?
I think there's a possibility of that. I mean, my experience, fortunately, is generally around where contracts are in place and there is good engagement with clients. My sort of negative experience is from driving around and observing places that quite obviously are not. But I think, certainly it's an opportunity for sure. If a system has been thrown into manual or switched off, bringing that back to life, maybe with a bit more awareness and a bit of a wake up call of what's happened. There is, I hope, awareness that, well, let's bring it back, and let's bring it back in a controlled way with good thought out processes relevant to the applications, and with people that really know what they're doing to be best positioned to do just that. I think it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity with the benefit of hindsight to get buildings and building controls to a better position.
Good, thank you. We've had
that too, that a couple of stories came to me during that initial lockdown of where the mechanical contractors and FM contractors did behave with all the best intentions. Switched off in order to save energy and run costs. And only after a period of time were the controls actually readjusted and recommissioned and systems put back into a standby mode so that we had adequate plant protection and pump and valve exercise and all of those practical things, practical boring things that we have to do in the live building.
I think a risk, just sorry to carry on that point a bit beyond, but a risk in the future, and let's keep everything crossed that we emerge out of the situation we find ourselves in at the moment. But an awful lot of energy saving realizations, let's say, or corrections, are from previous overrides that have been put in place for some good reason at some point in time and then forgotten about. And plant is found to be running in manual, and it's been in that state for months or something, without good management and control. One of my fears is, without good management and controls, some of the overrides that are in place now to provide this, more fresh air, less recirculation, could be left in place, and the energy efficiency of those things will suffer, obviously, if they're not corrected when, fingers crossed, we do come out of this sooner rather than later.
We've had a couple of interesting comments. I mean, we've talked about the negatives. We've talked about the energy efficiency taking a bit of a back burner. One of the questions that comes in is, what positive things do you think we've learned during lockdown? And things essentially that's going to help us to make sure that our commercial spaces are properly maintained going forward. Don't know, Mike, if you want to pick that one up.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it's exactly as Graeme said. It's an opportunity. I think it's an opportunity for landlords and tenants to gain more control, to have more visibility. I think it's an opportunity for integrators and contractors to be going to those people with the solutions that they need. I think it's also, it's a learning experience for us all. It's about making sure that we are prepared for, should the situation come around again, that actually these things are easy to change. And from our perspective, it makes the case even further for actually tighter integration between what are traditionally quite disparate building systems, so that you can get out unified information, that you can achieve unified control. We have a 46-bedroom private residence that we maintain for a football club. They have a single button that they can press that puts the entire building into vacant mode across every single building system. I think we'll see more demand for things like that. But then also on the flip side, making sure that we can get all the diagnostic information out easily, that we can demonstrate we're not, leaving overrides in place, that we're not running plant beyond capacity. And as Jamie said, it needs a real kind of collaborative mindset. This isn't, someone needs to kind of grab the flag and run off on their own, that they can achieve it all. In many, many buildings, it needs all of the people that maintain those different systems to come together and work out what's best. And once we get into operation on buildings, it's so rare for that to happen. It barely happens properly during commissioning at the end of buildings, let alone once we're into actual operation. So, I think it does need a reset in people's attitudes and approaches. And I think, there are always huge positives to come out of any crisis. There's loads.
So do you think that, one of the lessons we might have learned, you said, we barely managed to work together at the commissioning stage. Do you think one of the lessons we may have learned to take forward is that actually working together is good, and that as an industry, they might sort of work a lot more collaboratively for the benefit of the buildings that, that we're servicing?
I think it's always the hope, Tracy. But genuinely that, not me being facetious at all. I think, unfortunately, it is so project dependent in terms of the design and construction phases, and then in terms of operation, often depends on the management structure of the building and what people's motivators are, and goes right back to everything that Graeme was mentioning earlier. If you've got someone who is incentivized to do the best, they are incentivized to save the planet, then chances are they want a team that's all going to work together for the best outcome. If you've got someone that's just looking at the bottom line, they're just looking at the pounds and pence, they want the bare minimum. And the bare minimum is often well-engaged individual contractors on break-fix basis. And when something explodes, people are inconvenienced, and someone has to come along and give them the bad news that it's going to be a big bill to repair it. Like it really is, I think, going to create much more polarization between those people who kind of really get what needs to happen and get the new approaches, and those people who probably in 5 or 10 years' time are going to be really trying to find people to fill their building because it hasn't been well maintained, looked after, and doesn't offer the features that organisations now want. And let's be honest, the power has now shifted. Landlords can't expect people just to send in the rent checks every quarter. Tenants are in control. They need less space and they need higher quality space. That's what they're all pursuing. I
think it'd be a terrible shame, just to add to Mike's thing, if we didn't learn from this. It is a better way. There are a lot of positives. Just domestically, I can work from home far more efficiently than I ever thought I could. That in its own way is helping me and my carbon footprint, for example. But I think the lessons learned, it would be such a shame if everything went back to ways of working before, because I think this is such a wake-up call. Things can be so much better. It would be a terrible shame to go back. I think there is a risk of it, because obviously commercially the environment now is going to get super competitive. There's just the risk that because of that everything goes cheap. But that would be such a shame, because like I say, I can't think of anything in my lifetime, at least, there's been such a wake-up call as the situation we find ourselves in now. As I say, couple that with the climate emergency as well, that those two things, is just like this has to be the time to work better, to be more efficient, and building controls play their part in that.
And as you said before, they go hand in hand together. It's the same solution for both.
Yeah.
Moving on from that and what we've said there, interesting point, that an example you said, Mike, about that large multi-residential place where they've got a single switch where they turn everything off. And that's quite fascinating. And yet here we are at the Smart Buildings event, talking about the buildings and the technologies for the future. And so what do we think we'll see then when smart buildings were what we've been talking about for many years? How can we use that smart technology for things like desk allocation, our hot desk in Graeme's more efficient working from home, and benefits that brings everybody? How's that going to drive the future of our trade of BMS?
Is that one to Mike?
Anybody that's to us, rhetorically to us.
Well, I think that technology is such now, and costs are such that putting more sensors within buildings and having that data easily accessible, and the ability to process and understand what the data is telling us, the information it's giving us, it's such that we're able to start tying that information together. We're talking about ventilating buildings before. What's the point in ventilating a building if there's no one there? Especially if you've got hybrid working systems where people are working from home or deciding whether to go into the office. Online, you're able to determine that immediately, and perhaps even prepare for more people coming into the office because that's where they're headed. So you can, again, make those control systems more agile, and I think the interoperability of that, it's got to be the way forward, bringing additional data into those systems.
So we've got time, I think, just for one more question, and it's something that one of our delegates has asked the question. We have virtually zero building control. Our control involves me walking around the room, switching the lights on, switching them off again at the end of the day. So they're basically just looking for a sort of short burst of advice. Where do we start? Is it expensive? What do I do? How do I start? I think basically what he said on the question is he's listened to everything that you've said about being able to switch things off, being able to control things, particularly during COVID, and he's essentially said he spent the first 4 weeks of lockdown wondering if he switched the lights off. So if we just to sort of wrap up, really, if you could all just give him your best bit of advice on what to do. start with Terry. Sorry.
Well, thanks,
Come on,
Tracy.
Terry.
Here's my plug for the Trade Association. I would recommend that he starts with the building controls at bcia.co.uk, where there's a list of all of our members there that are all can advise and assist in helping you get to the control system that's required. In my day job, I would start with saying that understanding the requirements is critical and key, because the way that the industry is all sourced and we're all driven by cost and value. But what is required, isn't it, in the first instance? And I think the more time that we spend understanding the requirements and clearly detailing those, then the better the job will be delivered and maintained, and we can benefit from it thereafter.
Thank you, Terry. So let's hear from you, Jamie. What's your thoughts?
The first thing I'd always do is monitor the energy consumption at the building. If you're not sure what you're using and you haven't got that forensic line of the data, the person asking the question asked, he wasn't sure whether he turned off everything. Well, that's going to tell you if things are turned off, things are running, and you can do that remotely wherever you are. That will also help you to build the business case for control systems, potential savings that could be made by having those better controls in there. So that's where I'd always start to get that data, get that energy profile.
That's great, thank you. What about you, Mike?
So a bit tricky without knowing kind of building use and age of said building, but I think if it was modern enough, similar to Jamie, I think, get that understanding first. And then, as Terry was saying, gathering requirements always key before you make any kind of change to technology. There is, I think, the thing I would caution most against is there's a lot of great marketing out there. There's a lot of things that will promise to be silver bullets. But I think really understanding what you need from your building is the important part. And then moving on from there, once you've got the understanding, you know what you want to do, I think it's then doing a bit of a kind of system by system assessment of what's possible. So, can you retrofit things into what's there already? Do they support kind of open integration standards? And then being able to introduce that kind of interoperability between things at a later stage. But yeah, definitely start with an assessment. Don't leap into change, I think would be my...
Thank you. And Graeme?
I think just to add to what all of the previous speakers have said, I think it's highly unlikely there's no controls. There must be something there. It may be aging, it may be hidden away, but there must be something. But I think my advice is similar to the other guys. Start by making the invisible visible, so you can see what's going on and get a better understanding of what's happening. And it need not be expensive. This could be an approach, system by system or plant by plant, achievable within budget sort of lumps, and you can hit off the biggest consuming items to start with, and mature and develop a system over time. And as Terry said, a control specialist company will be able to offer that advice. It need not be a one-hit enormous expense to start with. It can be a progressive thing over time. But I would suggest start by making the invisible visible, and then you know what you're dealing with.
Thank you. So thank you all. That is unfortunately all we've got time for. We do have quite a lot more questions, and I would urge people that if your question's not been answered, sort of contact the panel directly, or head over to the BCIA website, where there is a lot of information there, as well as details on how to contact our members and contact people for further information. But for now, thank you very much to all of you.